So we're beginning to kind of wrap up the muscular system. We've got two more lectures left. Today's lecture is going to focus on the motor unit as well as how the muscle is fueled to contract. We're also going to go back and revisit those other types of muscle, and then we will wrap up this lecture. The next lecture you will watch is very short. It's on a few muscular disorders that we find for this system. So today, this lecture starts with the motor unit. And so basically, each muscle is served by a motor nerve, and that nerve has hundreds of little hair-like structures that come off of it that are known as axons. And so it's like you have this one cable, and then that cable branches off into all these little individual axons. And everywhere one of those axons touch or ends, where it touches the muscle, that's one of the neuromuscular junctions. And so it's typically one neuromuscular junction with each individual muscle fiber. So what happens is when our brain sends the action potential down the motor neuron, it sends it out to all the muscle fibers at one time. And so therefore, every neuromuscular junction goes through that same process that we learned in the last lecture to cause a muscle contraction to occur. So the minimum unit of contraction that we can have is the motor unit. So it's the big motor neuron and then all of the muscle fibers that are connected to it. We will talk about what happens when we have an imbalance. Some of our muscle fibers aren't really behaving like they're supposed to. But when we're talking about in homeostatic balance, one motor neuron with all of the muscle fibers that it connects to. Now, some of our muscles are always in a state of some type of contraction. We call that muscle tone, which we're going to look at in just a second. But basically, the scientific term is called tonus. And tonus is where some of the motor units are always activated even when the muscle is resting. But our muscles do have to rest. They can't stay contracted all the time. So when one muscle relaxes, another set picks up the slack, and then that leads us in this state of tone. So you see muscles that are always in some state of contraction. So muscle tone is important because it stabilizes joints and it maintains posture. Most individuals like muscle tone because it looks nice as well. When you hear someone talk about someone looking cut or someone looking very fit, they're discussing how their muscles, even when they're not contracting, you can see their muscles because they're in that state of tonus. And you want muscle tone because muscle tone helps to protect your skeletal system, because the better your muscles are, the less likely it is that you're going to have skeletal issues. So we talked about before, like when someone's going to have maybe knee surgery, they may go to physical therapy for a few weeks before their surgery and focus on the muscles around their knee to get those muscles in shape so that when they have the surgery, they can heal up faster and they're just stronger in that joint. Now, to get muscle tone, we have to work our muscles. So we have what's called types of contractions. We have isotonic contractions, and we have isometric contractions. So an isotonic contraction is when you lift something or you do something where you're using your muscle and your muscle is actually changing in length. So you're moving a load. That could be lifting weights. That could be doing push-ups or sit-ups. Anything, the load could be you. So it's anything that you're doing that's causing your muscles to work by moving something. Now, isometric contractions, these are where you don't lift. Instead, what you do is you increase tension. And we do this through isometric exercises like planking, or one of the more popular, yoga. Your muscle doesn't shorten or lengthen. Instead, it holds that contraction builds up that tension and it causes the muscle to become stronger. These are very important contractions. Everyone thinks isotonic is important, and isotonic is what we use to build muscle. A lot of times we'll tear down muscle by lifting heavier and then build those muscles up. But isometric is responsible for making your muscles stronger, helps to give them more of endurance, and it helps to tone your muscles really well. And so isometric is just as important. And actually, in the Google Classroom, you're going to find a video on yoga, and I would highly recommend that you go and watch that video and try to do some of those yoga poses, and you'll be really surprised at how difficult some of them are. And you may even be surprised the next morning when you wake up and you're a little sore because you use muscles in a way that you may not be used to. So how do we fuel these muscle contractions? So to fuel our muscle contraction, we have to use adenosine triphosphate, which is ATP. We learned about it in biology. We break down glucose, and in breaking down glucose, it allows us to put together this ATP molecule. And ATP is very important because when we break off the phosphate, it gives us a burst of energy and it allows our cells to do things. So we use ATP when we're going through the sliding filament model. In order for us to build the cross bridge between the actin and the myosin, it requires us to have ATP. Also, for us to be able to pump the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum to stop the building of the cross bridge, we have to use ATP because that's active transport, and we know that requires energy. So we're constantly using energy, and our ATP pool is only large enough to give us about 4 to 6 seconds of contraction if we're not constantly producing more ATP. Luckily, we do. If everything in your cells are working properly and you're in homeostatic balance, you make about 10 million ATPs per second per cell. So you're making plenty of ATP, but if something happens and you're unable to make that ATP, you only have about a 6-second window before you start to feel the effects of an ATP deficit. So where do we get our energy from? We get it from creatine phosphate, we get it from glycogen, and we get it from cellular respiration. So creatine phosphate is basically a amino acid combination that gets its phosphate from ATP, and then after the phosphate's broken off, it's given back to ADP to create ATP once again. So it's a high energy phosphate. Phosphates are usually very, very high in energy, and so it's a high energy thing that we can get. However, it is not the sole source of ATP, and it's not even the best source of ATP. Sometimes we use glycogen. Glycogen is anaerobic respiration. So basically our body turns on itself and begins to break down glycogen that's stored in our cells and our muscles so that we can get enough energy in order for us to be able to go through, the functions that we need to go through. We form lactic acid. Not a whole lot of lactic acid's formed here, but it is enough to keep the muscles functioning if for some reason they fail to get proper oxygen. Aerobic respiration is where it's at, though. This is what we want. 95% of all the ATP that we need for our muscular system to work like they're supposed to, that ATP comes from aerobic cellular respiration. So this is where we take glucose, we break it down, it goes through glycolysis, it goes through the Krebs cycle, it goes through the electron transport chain, and in doing so, it produces 38 ATPs per glucose, 36 net profit. And that's very important. Anytime that our body is without oxygen, our body begins to build up that lactic acid. And so we have to use aerobic cellular respiration to pay back that oxygen debt that we created. And then on top of everything, we're still having to make ATP just for our general every second movements that we have. And this is what it kind of looks like if you remember back to Biology 1. So what happens when our muscles get tired? So sometimes we're using more energy than we can make. And when that happens, our muscles begin to contract less and less effectively. We've talked about this before. You go and you work out and your arms kind of begin to feel like jello, or your legs begin to feel like jello, or it's just like you can't put forth the effort like you have been. What's happening is muscle fatigue is setting in. So because muscle fatigue is setting in, the muscle's not contracting as well. Sometimes it can even stop receiving the stimulus from the motor neurons, which means that it can't contract at all. So muscle fatigue is basically the state of physiologically physiological inability to contract, meaning I just can't move. And so we've used up all the ATP and our body needs to regenerate ATP to pull us out of that deficit. The muscle fatigue is an ATP deficit, not a total absence. And people get confused about this. They think when I'm laying there and I can't get up and move, that means I don't have, I'm totally out of ATP. What it means is we're just, if used more ATP than we should have, and our body needs a few seconds to regenerate. When we totally run out of ATP, we have a different reaction. It's called a contracture. Basically, what happens is your body causes your muscles to go into a state of continuous contraction. And it's because we need ATP to break the cross bridges in the sliding filament model. So if you can't break the cross bridges, then that means the muscle stays rigid and contracted. And a good example of that is writer's cramp. Now, you think you've had writer's cramp before when you're writing a paper for a teacher, but what you were experiencing was muscle fatigue. True writer's cramp means that when you go to drop your pencil, your hand stays cramped up like it was in the writing position. And it's because you can't release that contraction. So you have to rub and rub and rub to make sure that oxygen gets in there so that it can begin to pay back that ATP deficit. Sometimes we begin to feel it because you'll get this burn. I know one of the things people will say, like in aerobics classes, they'll say, feel the burn, feel the burn, feel the burn. Because what happens is when our muscles go into fatigue, because we don't have any oxygen, we begin to accumulate lactic acid, and lactic acid burns your muscles. It causes the pH to drop. You've experienced before if you've been sound asleep and pointed your feet during your sleep, and all of a sudden you get a Charlie horse from hip to toe and your whole leg is hurting and you have to stand up and move around. The reason why you stand up is to get oxygen in there so that way that muscle can begin to relax. But what's happening in there is we're not getting the potassium where we're supposed to. Sodium is flooding into the muscle. And so now we're building up this ATP because we're going through anaerobic respiration. Once ATP is able to be regenerated because oxygen gets there, the muscle will begin to revert back to its regular contractions. However, if you've had a bad enough contraction, a bad enough cramp in the night, you may feel lactic acid the next day. Your muscles will become very unresponsive sometimes, and then they will ache. And I know that like after you've completed like an aerobic activity or a game or something like that, a lot of times your coaches may tell you to go jog. And you're thinking to yourself, why in the world am I going to jog when I just played ball for 2 hours? Or it's because they're wanting you to try to get that lactic acid out of your muscles so that you won't be sore the next day. So back to the different types of muscles. So we spent a lot of time talking about skeletal muscles. So I just want to real quickly go back into cardiac muscle and smooth muscle and talk about a few things. So remember, cardiac muscle is heart muscle. It looks a lot like skeletal muscle, except that when you look at cardiac muscle under the microscope, the myofibrils are not long and straight. Instead, they're branched. And that's because we want the branches to interlock. Every time our heart beats, it's a very violent reaction. And if the branches didn't interlock, every time your heart beats, you would run the risk of ripping your heart open. So those interlocking branches of the cardiac muscle makes your heart work and keeps it protected. The other cool thing about cardiac muscle is, remember I told you it's involuntary. That's because our brain doesn't send the action potential. Instead, the heart takes care of itself. So it tells itself when it needs to beat. It tells itself when it needs to beat harder or when it needs to beat slower. Our fibers in our heart beat in a synchronous wave. You may remember from the very first unit, we watched a video where they showed two myofibrils from the cardiac muscle touching. When they didn't touch, they beat at two different rates, but when they touch them together, they begin to beat in synchronous waves. That's because we want our heart to beat synchronously, so that way we get the most effective blood pumping mechanism that we can have in our body. Anytime that our heart beats out of synchronization or it becomes asynchronous, we call that fibrillation. And sometimes they'll even use a machine that kind of resets your heart called a defibrillator. It shocks you to make your heart begin to beat again in that continuous wave. When oxygen is limited to the heart, it's different than with skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle will get a cramp, will burn that muscle with lactic acid, but we'll rebuild muscle fibers. In the heart, when you have a lack of oxygen to the heart, usually because of some type of blockage, it causes damage to that area, and we know that as a heart attack, which we'll talk a little bit more about in our next unit. So finally, let's talk about smooth muscle. So smooth muscle has no striations. So when you look at it under the microscope, it kind of looks like pink bubble gum. It's just a smooth plane of muscle. And it does not depend on motor neurons to be stimulated. Instead, it's kind of an involuntary stimulation, but contractions are different than skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. Instead, it's a slow contraction, a lot of undulating contractions that are basically forcing fluid through hollow cavities. And so contractions are usually sustained for a much longer period of time as well. So that wraps it up for this one. Our next unit will cover muscle diseases. So be sure that you're going back, reviewing the notes and the lectures from this unit so that you are, well aware of what the muscular system is all about. And we'll have that one last lecture in our next series. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.